It's slightly different than infrastructure as code environment where you have a repo of YAML files or something, and whenever you change them, it pushes out and it says, okay, now I'm going to make the world look like that. But this infrastructure as software has a tighter loop, and it has more consistency to say, hey, if anything changes right now, I'm going to revert that change. I'm going to make sure that the world constantly looks like this with running software and not just a repository full of code. That really was like the key thing that we came out of cloud native infrastructure. We saw that pattern over and over again at successful companies. Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, like all these companies are focusing on how do we run our infrastructure, not by people always reverting changes, but software doing that. And Kubernetes was, again, the controllers pattern was kind of the North Star for us to say, like, this is how it's done.
Hello and welcome to Committing to Cloud Native, the podcast where we talk about the interface between open source and cloud native. We're super excited about our guest today, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hey everyone, I'm here with Justin Garrison. He's a developer advocate at Amazon. He lives in Los Angeles like me. We share the first name. So hey Justin, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, Justin.
Awesome. So before Amazon, you were at Disney. What's under the hood there? You worked on Disney Plus. Talk about this.
I was at Disney Animation for 4.5 years, doing infrastructure for the feature animated films, working on render farm, artist workstations, internal servers, which is a great eye-opening experience. And I learned a lot of deep Linux technology and kind of how to run things at scale, especially on-prem. But we're also using multiple different services, and it was really when containers were starting to come around, and I started focusing more and more on how that could enable developers to deploy things on-prem or in the cloud. And it was really impressive for me just to be able to work in that environment. And then I moved over to Disney streaming services, which created Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, a lot of different smaller streaming services in there. And I ran infrastructure for them. Behind the scenes of Disney Plus is Amazon.
Oh,
it's a lot of Amazon. I really started learning a lot more about how to run services in Amazon at scale and how to do things with native services. And my team was specifically in charge of the centralized container infrastructure we had. So with the containers that we were running in Amazon, what did that look like? How did we enable developers to deploy in simple ways? So there's actually quite a few different Disney Plus talks at reInvent from last year. So if you want to find out some of the details about how Disney Plus runs very specific things, I want to say there were 3 or 4 talks at reInvent, which go deep into how we were deploying things, how we were running things, what AWS services we were using at Disney Plus. And I did a talk with my old coworker, Zach. And so we were on the same team at Disney Plus, and then I had switched over to Amazon. And so it was great talking to him about how we created the deployment tools and how we were managing the centralized infrastructure, lower the cognitive load for a lot of developers to not have to learn everything about the entire stack of like, okay, where's Linux running? Where's the container fit in? Where's the scheduler fit in? Where's Amazon components and VPC in there? So we kind of took care of all of that for them and gave them more of a platform style environment of just saying, hey, I have an app. Here's my container. Deploy 100 of them. Mm-hmm. And we'd make sure that gets done and it's highly available. And all of the best practices that we had for logging and monitoring and some defaults for dashboards and all that stuff just got created for them out of the box. And they didn't have to really worry about it or think about it. And then they could tweak and change things as they had need.
Did they just like poach you from reInvent?
I was really excited learning so much about Amazon from Disney Animation and Disney Streaming and just saying, hey, like I have learned a lot in the last 6 years at Disney, and I could really turn that around and help more people do these things in Amazon, do very similar things in Amazon. So I was first and foremost a customer that was just like telling people about it. And I was going to my own conferences and telling people, hey, this is Kubernetes, here's EKS, here's how containers help, and doing those things day to day. And then now I do it for my day job. It's not actually something I do on the weekends or at nights or anything. It's like, hey, when I reached out to Amazon and said, I love these services, can I help other people use them better? I had a great interview experience and onboarding to say, like, this is how we're doing these things here. If this is the right way, I would love to help more customers and more people just be successful in these areas.
I mean, you literally like wrote the book on cloud native infrastructure. Was that before or after you joined?
That was before. I was at Disney Animation. So that was before Disney Plus. Someone in the Kubernetes community reached out and said, hey, saw you were doing some things. And I was doing writing on the side, my own blog. I've written for blogs in the past. I really like writing. I like written communication. And someone reached out, Riley's looking for an author for this style book. And it was really around CNCF tooling and how that looked. And the first time I started outlining it, it was early days of Kubernetes, and we weren't really sure what we wanted to put in the book or anything. And so I reached out to Kelsey at the time, was writing Kubernetes Up and Running. And I asked him, hey, what advice do you have for writing a book? And the first thing he said was get a co-author. And so I was like, that's great advice. And so I didn't know a co-author at the time. I was just like, I don't know who to reach out to. So I started talking to people, especially within the CNCF community. And multiple people recommended Chris. And so Chris and I had never met before. We had known each other like in passing in the community, but never met. And so with that, I reached out to her, and she brought so much great experience. She was a SIG chair lead for SIG AWS inside of the Kubernetes community already. So I was like, hey, you're doing a lot in AWS. She was a co-maintainer for Kops, which is a Kubernetes deployment tool on top of AWS. So we started talking, and it was great just to be able to take her experience from what she was doing in open source in the community and what I was doing sort of in an enterprise side of things to be able to say like, hey, how does this work for anyone? And the first iteration of the book changed a lot, because at first it was really about Kubernetes, and it was about how to like set up projects and where they fit in. And we wrote the first draft and we threw away most of it because it was already out of date. And it was something that was just like, you know what, like these projects change too fast. This environment changes too fast. So we went back to say, okay, what are the patterns? What are the things that really will make the book last more than 2 years? And what can we put in here to teach someone, hey, don't look at like a new tool or a new, option for something. Look at how it works and look at where that gets applied. And that really got us down to what we call infrastructure as software, which is what you see inside of you're using Kubernetes, the control loop. It has software that runs, it takes some data, and it constantly looks at that state of the world and says, what's the desired state that you want me to change? What's the current state of the world? And how do I make that happen? And that's what the controller constantly does over and over again. And it's slightly different than infrastructure as code environment, where you have a repo of YAML files or something, and whenever you change them, it pushes out and it says, okay, now I'm going to make the world look like that. But this infrastructure as software has a tighter loop, and it has more consistency to say, hey, if anything changes right now, I'm going to revert that change. I'm going to make sure that the world constantly looks like this with running software and not just a repository full of code. So that really was like the key thing that we came out of cloud native infrastructure. We saw that pattern over and over again at successful companies, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, like all these companies are focusing on how do we run our infrastructure, not by people always reverting changes, but software doing that. And Kubernetes was, again, the controller's pattern was kind of the North Star for us to say, like, this is how it's done, but also calling out other places where it's done. Like Netflix has chaos monkeys. That's like a controller pattern that's like doing the wrong thing, essentially. It's causing chaos, but it's still infrastructure as software in the case of like, it's not waiting for a Git commit. It's not waiting for someone to make a change. It's always looking at the environment. It's always measuring the environment. And it says, hey, what happens if DNS goes away or this instance goes away or something? And it can do that as running software. And so you want the more productive infrastructure as software patterns, not necessarily destructive, but chaos engineering has grown into its own to say, hey, like, there's a lot of great tools that will also allow you to verify that your infrastructure tooling will correct things on the fly and not wait for a human intervention.
What about remote conferences and talks? What's going on there?
With COVID, a lot has changed in that space, and I've tried to be innovative. It's a lot like my room is actually tore apart right now because I'm recording a couple of conference talks. I'm trying to do it in a different way. People don't like watching remote conference talks. Like, there's just not like a PowerPoint slide deck isn't always the most entertaining thing. But if I look at things like YouTube, a normal YouTube video, and say like, hey, what's successful here? And it is more engaging. There's a little more polish and producing put into it. Mm-hmm. And then I also think of like, if I don't want to watch a conference talk, what is something that I do want to watch? And to me, it was like, well, I'll watch TV episodes. I'll watch 20 minutes of a TV episode. I might learn something from it, and I'll do that anytime. Like, I'll just keep binge watching them, but I won't do that with conference talks. So what if conference talks were more like TV shows? What if we actually changed the format? What if there was no slide deck? What if it was tell a story? What if it was entertaining first? And if you learn something, that's good. And there's actually a quote from Walt Disney, where he says, if you make something entertaining and someone learns something from it, that's great. But if you make it, educational first and it's not entertaining, what's the point? Like that's not his goal. His goal was entertainment first. Hopefully someone learned something too. And I've really taken that of like, that's what I'm trying to do. And so I had a KubeCon talk last year, which got a lot of great feedback of, there was no slide deck. I literally filmed the mini movie in 20 something minutes or 30 minutes. And I tried to teach people what it was like to run infrastructure for this entertainment business, because it's not well known for a lot of people. So I literally started with like, what is it like to render a movie, and what does that infrastructure look like? And then what does it look like to stream that movie? And what are different design considerations? And why is that infrastructure different? And why is it, something that is important to have in both sides? Like you can't have the same specialty of just like, oh, the render infrastructure can't also stream the movie. It needs to be separate for various reasons, and why.
Well, it's interesting because obviously with the past couple of years, everything's been remote in terms of events. And I saw a few people give recorded presentations and they were really good. I was like, there's some people that are just like, oh, it doesn't count if it's recorded. I'm like, why? If it's interesting and it keeps you glued, like, I don't know. I like it. Like you were saying, like a TV show.
I don't know when this podcast is airing, but I have a talk that I recorded that's going live next week for DevOps Days in Portland. And the talk is called TikTok, TALK. But I recorded 5 TikTok videos, and I stitched them together. And I said, hey, I could tell a story with TikToks, because that as a format is really interesting to me. And it adds some things that you can't do in a normal style. Like, here's my slide deck. Here's some things to talk about. Like, I actually able to switch scenes. I even switched clothes. I recorded some of them on different days. Like, there was a lot that went into doing that style formats that was different, but being able to be creative in that space to me has been just a ton of fun. And I love bringing just that like different view on like, how do we make this better for the audience? Still, they can learn something from it. It doesn't have to be just here's a bunch of data. Oh, like learn 1 or 2 things and be entertained, and more people will see it and more people will learn.
How is the open source community on TikTok? Is there one? My fear with TikTok is I'm going to get addicted, because every time I see a TikTok video, I'm 5 and I'm like, whoa, where the hell did the time go? And I'm just like, I can't install this thing.
It's definitely an outlet for a lot of people. What are you watching TikTok for? Most people, I think, are watching it for entertainment. They want to be entertained. They want to feel some emotion. And a lot of times that's laughter, especially in the last year and a half of, being on lockdown and being remote. It's like people need to laugh. It's something that is kind of core to who we are. And TikTok in a lot of ways brings that in small chunks of 1 to 3 minutes. I can just keep saying, nope, wasn't funny, keep going. But it's important for everyone. And so there are some people that do really cool like developer content.
Oh,
I really admire the dev talk sort of space where a lot of people want to learn, like change their lives. And being a developer, breaking into technology for so many people is life-changing. It's life-changing for what they're able to do, where they're able to work, how they get jobs, and being able to afford things. So there's quite a few people that I've seen on there that some of it is, the funny side of it. We're like, hey, I'm a developer. Only a developer would understand this joke. Right. But also the other side of like, hey, if you want to learn how to be a developer, here's some links. Here's some things you should learn. And both sides are valid because it's needed for depending on where people are at. But it's cool. I follow some of them and seeing those videos on my For You page come up is really great just to see how people are using that. And so like my content that I've posted is mostly like on the funny side, not sometimes on the educational side, but I really try to like figure out the format and how you can use these different formats, podcasts, YouTube videos, TikToks. There's so many different mediums and they all have pros and cons.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's interesting. I've seen a few that were front end focused, like the CSS community. Like they always have some good memes on Twitter, but like I never like thought cloud native and like low level programming would have like a market there. But please drop your TikTok link in the chat. We put that in the notes. That's something I'm definitely going to check out. I'm not going to install TikTok, but I'm going to check it out. One thing that caught my eye was Bash Scheduler. And you say it's an open source project that you wrote, and I'll let you go more into it. But you said it's a really bad idea. I'm biased because I really like Bash. I love Bash. I've interviewed the creator of it not too long ago, and episode 22, by the way. And what is Bash Scheduler? What does it do? What'd you make it for?
I made it to learn. I'm a project-based learner. And so I wanted to learn the Kubernetes API. I didn't know about extending Kubernetes. I started it 4 years ago, something like that, when Kubernetes was still early and someone told me you can add third-party schedulers to Kubernetes. And I said, really? How does that work? Well, where do you do that? And then I just started diving into the API. And one of the cool things about Kubernetes is the structure of the APIs is once you understand the patterns, you can do a lot. You can figure out, oh, this is repeated every time. And even for native objects or CRDs or whatever, it's just the same pattern over and over again. And sure, there's libraries and things to help you do more advanced scalable things. But I want to say, can I take a bash script and take a pod and put it on a node and make it run? And that's what Bash Scheduler was for. It was just, okay, well, let's just randomly take some pod and put it on a node. And so I was doing this in my free time years ago, just saying, okay, and I wanted to do it with native tools. The first iteration of it actually didn't use JQ at all. So I was parsing the JSON output with sed and awk. Yeah.
I thought that so many times.
Yeah. And so like I was like, oh, I want to be like a bash purist here and not use those easy tools like JQ. And so when I rewrote it this past year, I was like, you know, like I can make this way shorter and more understandable for other people to also learn if I just use JQ and say, hey, this is where the object is. And so at that point, it turned into I wasn't learning from it anymore. I wasn't using it. To me, it was 3 really cool things. One was just how easy and structured the API is. 2, how easy it is to extend pieces in Kubernetes by looking them up by saying like, hey, a scheduled pod is just a pod that has some metadata on it that says where it's supposed to go. And then the kubelet, everything else happens after the fact. And the third thing actually was something that I didn't think I would learn, but how easy it is to get a feedback loop of Kubernetes and how much that enables learning. And that was really exciting for me because I could do a kube control proxy and I had access to the API server. And I was like, wait a minute, like I had used tools in the past. I had used Mesos. I had used these other things in the past, and I could never do it that easily. And so being able to just all of a sudden, no matter where I was or where the Kubernetes cluster was, create a cluster and then access the API with my own authentication, all that stuff was just taken care of. And I was just curling localhost. And then I was like, wait a minute, it's that easy? Okay, now let me see what this does when I actually package this up in a container and put it in Kubernetes, and it essentially has similar access. I give it a service account, tell it can call the API server. And then I was like, okay, now that feedback loop was so powerful because that's where people learn. It's not like reading a doc. It's not necessarily watching a video. It's doing something and saying, having that aha moment of, oh, this is different. I get this now. When I've created Bash Scheduler, that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to do it with another library. I wrote a lot of Python in the past, and I was like, I don't really want to do it with Python. I want to try it with Bash and just see like, if I can do it with Bash, it's simple enough that I could do it with anything. And just being able to do it with curl and JQ was very powerful.
I said in the past, it always starts with the Bash script and it just stays with the Bash script. I mean, Bash and YAML is like in every single cloud native related repository. So it's just, I mean, I thought it was really interesting.
Of every programming language I've learned, I've gotten the most mileage out of Bash.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I can turn to.
It's everywhere. It's on Mars, for God's sakes. It's just really great tool, I think, for anyone who used even Unix-like or Windows now. It's just a great scripting language.
And for me, years ago, I set limits for myself on Bash. And I knowing when to turn to the tool or when to turn away from it was really important. And so I learned through doing my own development and working in various environments that basically I have a couple rules for when I stop using Bash. And that's typically when the script itself becomes more than 100 lines. If it's 100 lines, more than 100 lines at some point, I probably should change to something else, and I can condense things and I can make it easier for humans to read after the 100 lines. The second one is if I have to accept more than 2 arguments on the script. Once I have a switch statement that has 3+ arguments, maybe 5, it's just going to keep growing at that point. And if I reach 2, I know I'm going to have 10. And at that point, I'm like, I want a better arg parsing library. I want something that's going to do some better options just on that Unix style strings, and set ops just isn't great. And then the third thing was really around if I needed to use an array. If I have to turn to any sort of Bash array, like in Bash Scheduler, I use one. But once I start hitting an array, I know I'm doing something a little more complex for a scripting language. And I try to look for something else because like, you know what? I can do this a lot easier in Ruby or Python or Go. Maybe I should just switch it up now. Because once you invest all the time, it's going to be harder to switch. And so those are kind of my 3 rules of like, I will use Bash all day until I hit one of those 3 things. And then I will look for the next best tool.
I like that. It's like the 3 rules to succeed in scripting. And
it's helped me a lot because by starting with Bash, I can build things so much faster. I can POC things. I can't tell you how many internal tools and some open source projects I've started that were a Bash script. I used those same rules and I said, hey, this is the POC. The next version should be written in some other language for these reasons. And let's rewrite from there. And we didn't invest too much time in that POC, but we got the user experience. We got some of the functionality, and then we could see how it would grow from there.
Yeah, I mean, you're disciplined.
I failed so many times. And so like by failing and saying, once I was managing the 500 line Bash script, then I was like, I've made some mistakes. And that's when I started learning the hard way, these rules.
Right. That's cool. And one other thing I saw, which was pretty cool, is you have a linux.com email address. Like, how do you get one of those?
It was something that I didn't know about, but the Linux Foundation has individual memberships that you can pay for. So for $150, you get a lifetime email address from the Linux Foundation, which is a linux.com email. So I paid for one a long time ago, and I don't know how many, like I got Justin just because it was there. And so it's Justin at Linux. And I was like, that's cool. And it's just an email redirector. It's not like anything special, but I have, a lifetime membership with the Linux Foundation, and it forwards that email for me. And so I thought it was cool. I saw someone else have one and they had a really short one. And I was like, I think I want that. And so
an OG name.
Yeah, exactly. When it was a first name only short domain, I was like, that's really cool. I think I want one of those. So yeah, so it's a redirector for me.
Still made me go, wow, that's pretty impressive. Speaking of impressive, I looked at your resume and it's a man page. Did you think of that, or did you get an idea from someone else? I want to just kind of do mine like that now, but I feel like I'd be ripping you off. How did you get the idea? You're just like, you know what, man page, I think would be a great resume format.
Someone else. I found it from someone else. His name's Major.
Oh, Major Hayden.
Yep.
Oh, from Rackspace.
Yep. He had it first. He's the first place I saw it. And so he has it it's in HTML. It was up on his website. And so I condensed it. I've been using that same style for a long time because I was so familiar with the format. And I think I've had more comments in my career about the format of the man page than the content on the resume.
It looks legit. And I was like, whoa, the man? Oh, wait a minute. It's his resume.
It did teach me a lot about being unique to get some attention. It doesn't do great with automated parsers for man pages and that sort of stuff because it's just, I would have to export a PDF from it. So I make the HTML, I make it a single page, and then I export a PDF. And that's what I would send. But also, top tip for anyone doing a resume, store it in a Git repo. Put your resume in a Git repo. I've been doing that for, I don't know, a decade now almost. And I have forks of hey, here's the job path that I was looking at this other company. I have, tags that would show, hey, here's the one I submitted to this company on this date. And being able to review that history was super valuable for me as I was, growing in my career and looking at other opportunities, and even just learning from my own mistakes in the past of just hey, this wasn't resume.v2 docs. This was actually hey, git log. Oh, there's that fork that I had. That had some content that I remembered. Or here's the tag of if I applied at the same company multiple times, I could see the versions that I applied on a fork. Having that history is invaluable because you forget so much. Or at least I do.
Especially the older you get, I would always be amazed that my mom wouldn't remember certain things, and because I remembered everything when I was younger. And then once you you get in your 30s and you just start to go, wait, I never said that. Did I say that? And then it's they play it for you. I'm like, oh my God, I totally forgot. So I'm going to start doing that. I think that's actually a really great idea because you can just see the evolution of your resume and your life, your professional career.
And even if you're doing a Word file, right? You're doing Microsoft Word or something, that's still text. It's just markup text. So it's harder to diff. HTML and the man page resume was really easy because it's just HTML and CSS. But there's definitely value. I would still commit the PDF, which was just a blob. And she's hey, here I can see the snapshot of the thing. I really think that I had a lot of value out of doing Git for my resume, but also I would keep what's called a brag document. Julie Evans, I think is her name. She does the wizard design, the comics online of different Linux tools and networking tools and stuff. She's amazing at pushing all this stuff. And I first read about using a brag doc from a blog post she wrote. I have a quarterly reminder, fill out your brag doc. And I just put a couple summaries of the things I'm proud of that I worked. Not necessarily all the projects, not necessarily like everything I did. Just like, hey, if I look back in 3 months, like what would be the 2 things that I'd say, like, I was proud I did that, or I was happy I worked on that, or something big I learned. I put those in the brag doc and I've been keeping those for years now. And so 4 times a year, I fill out a section of that, and it helps with yearly reviews, all that stuff, but also it helps with the resume. Because then I look back, hey, my 6 years at Disney, what did I work on? What was I proud of? And I can review that and say like, hey, you know what I was really proud of? Like I was proud that I worked on Moana and Wreck-It Ralph 2. Like all these things are like awesome, but like, hey, what did I actually contribute? What was the thing that I was doing for those, projects? And what was it that I would put on my resume? And that's where the brag doc came in. And then I could see that tracking in the Git repo for resume, but also in those brag docs. Great career advice that I learned from 2 different places.
I do on my website, I post things that are public, but I don't keep track of like internal things that you can't link to. So I think that's actually a really good idea. And the way I version it, I do my age. So I do like 3.6, and then the dot is the amount of times I've edited the site in my 3.6, my 36 year mark. So that's been working good, but I think that there's a lot of things that I forget because they're not like something you can just link to. I like that. The brag doc. I got to look that up. So is there going to be like a cloud native infrastructure follow-up book, or are you kind of done with being an author?
I enjoyed being an author. I enjoyed writing the book. Chris and I debated writing a version 2 because there was a lot missing. And when we wrote the book, it came out into 17. So we were writing it early 17 and taking everything we learned from 2016 through mid 2017 and putting it in the book. And even things like Lambda and serverless were like just coming around, and security in the cloud. And there was a lot of things in here that weren't necessarily available, and people hadn't really failed at it enough to have a way to learn and to teach people. And so there's things we would love to put in there as like a V2 to extend on a lot of it. The pattern, I think, is still the same, where even with security, even with some other thing you're trying to do, if you want to run it at scale, having software manage that thing through some sort of declarative state is probably the way to go. But we haven't really scheduled or started working on any sort of V2 for it. We've both done a lot since. She's gone on to take the idea of infrastructure as software and really implement it in different tools in different areas, especially in the Kubernetes community. Things like Cluster API are kind of direct descendants from that idea of how do you manage infrastructure. Kubernetes is great at managing pieces of infrastructure within the, for the cluster, but how do you manage Kubernetes itself? How do you manage more things inside of that, the greater scheme of what your infrastructure means, including things like PagerDuty schedules and on-call. Those sorts of things are also part of your infrastructure, and people don't think of it that way. But it's really critical to have those aspects be rolled into these changes, because once you have a disconnect between the documentation and the runbooks and the code that's running and who gets paged, you're going to have a hard time. There's going to be some disconnect there where nothing lined up properly. And so treating all of those things as critical infrastructure are really important. So yeah, like we still talk about it a lot. We still try to keep people educated and know what the next thing is on like how they can be successful with the patterns. But we haven't really done anything with writing another version for the book.
We've had a couple authors on the podcast, and one fellow, he did a self-publish, and then he just did like not an O'Reilly, but like a publisher. And he said just the back and forth with the person who checks.
The editor?
The technical editor. Yeah. So he just said it was just like, I'm never going to do that. I'm just going to do self-publish. It's just so difficult. But I think O'Reilly is just such a great brand. And it's like, it's got to be such an accomplishment. Was that your first book?
Yeah. So I wrote a blog post a while ago about the economics of writing a technical book, because a lot of people ask about like, well, did you make money? What was the process like? So I actually lay that out a lot in this blog post. It's a couple of years old now from that, but actually 2018. So 3 years old. But I really tried to put any information that I had at the time in there, because it was great writing my first book with a group that was professional, and they knew the process and they knew the timing for things. And I didn't have to get an editor and do all the reviews myself, because as much as I like writing, I'm not great at grammar itself and knowing consistency for capitalization or a comma versus an em dash or something like that. So there's a lot of benefits in just having professionals review that work and help make it better in so many ways. And then the CNCF was great with the book as well because it came out right around the time of a KubeCon. And so I was working with Chris and Dan from CNCF at the time. They loved that we were writing a book around this ecosystem. Dan has a quote on the back of the book, which I was forever thankful for him being able to like be part of that and promote it as well. It was a great experience. Going forward for me, I might do like self-published in the future, something like that, for something that is more low key or something that is not necessarily like a professional endeavor. I get really excited about remote work and I get excited about culture and I get excited about process for things. So I love addressing some of those topics too, which isn't necessarily like the O'Reilly technical sort of background for like the audience.
Yeah, no, totally. So you were at Disney. Did you get an Oscar?
My first movie credit is Zootopia, which did win an Oscar. And so I was able to hold the Oscar.
Oh.
But the Oscar goes to the directors of the film.
Are they heavy?
Yeah.
That's got to be really cool seeing your name in the credits. It's just like, whoa.
The recognition, I think, is something that we could really bring into the software industry.
Interesting.
It's a artifact of a history of Hollywood where credits used to be at the beginning of films. This isn't something that like, they didn't used to be this like mile long scroll at the end. They had basically the top billing, people would be at the beginning of the film and there'd be nothing at the end. And we don't really have that same organization or recognition inside of software or inside of open source. But I guess that the like closest thing you could see is like a maintainer's file or an owner's file or something in a Git repo, but it's not really celebrated the same way. And I do think there could be a notion of having more celebration and having more like formal recognition for those things, even if it's like at this point in time, because movies are box software. Modern movies, it's a snapshot in time of a development and it goes in a box, literally on a disk, on a box. It's in the bits get translated if you bring home a DVD or something like that. But even in streaming services, right? Like it's a artifact in time. Software's not really like that. Software constantly changes. It's something that is always like, you can't take a snapshot of Disney Plus. Because when I was there at Disney Plus, like it's completely different, a lot of aspects from a year and a half, 2 years later.
Yeah, I think GitHub's doing a pretty good job with their stars program. Daniel Stenberg, who founded Curl, and he just got like a real gold star sent to him with a bunch of swag and everything. And then they highlighted him on the blog and being a maintainer for 30 plus years. So GitHub's definitely do that, but it shouldn't stop there.
Recognizing I don't want to say top billing, but like the real stars, the people that are very public and very much in front of, they've done a lot of work for sure. Like they've put in the time. The first company that started listing everyone, like the first company that said, hey, we want to list our legal department. We want to list marketing. We want to list movie production babies. Like that didn't come around until Pixar in Toy Story. They're like, no, everyone helped make this film. Even though there was voice actors, even though there was artists, they wanted to say, everyone should get their name in the credits. And at the time, that was controversial. That was something that the movie industry said, no, like only top billing gets that. You can't make them too long. And so they actually have a break. If you go back and watch original Toy Story, there's a line break that says Pixar would also like to thank. It's not part of the credits.
Interesting.
But that's how they kind of were like, hey, we want to get around this rule and give everyone credit for their input on this. Everyone from onboard training to HR to finance, like they helped make this film and they put all those names in the credits, which I thought was really fascinating just to see like how that's grown to now. It's just everyone, that's what you do. Like everyone gets, if you're at the studio for whatever the rules are working on a film, like you get your name in a credit.
It's got to be just a real big confidence booster, or I don't know, just something where it feels good to get recognized. And I think that's definitely something that the open source community and cloud native community can take after.
Even if your name is 8 minutes down the 10-minute scroll, it's still that recognition and it shows that you had some ownership and you can actually point back to that. And that is important.
The thing is, especially with open source, there's so many people, non-code contributors and non-technical contributors that do amazing things behind the scenes, but how do we get them in?
I do think that CNCF has done a really good job about having the Chop Wood Carry Water awards at KubeCon, where they say, hey, this isn't someone that necessarily was in front of the camera. Wasn't someone that was like, they were doing the work and they were really pushing for this stuff behind the scenes, and recognizing those people on stage with an award, I think was a great first thing for them to just step up and say like, these people are really important. We need to make sure that they have that recognition. Even if no one else is seeing it, they were.
Yeah. Before I joined CNCF world, I didn't realize how many people were kind of in the background. Amy and Bill and like all these folks that don't really touch GitHub or anything, but have such a huge impact in the foundation and just the ecosystem as a whole. There's other names I'm blanking on, but yeah, I mean, it's just Christy, like all these people that are doing communications and getting everything organized for different events and meetups and this and that. So it's just a really cool, it's just a cool community. I'll be honest. It's very organized, and yeah, I mean, it's just really awesome to be part of.
The contributor experience, the SIG dedicated to that, to grow the community and make sure that people coming on board to the community are having a good experience. Like they actually gather data to say, hey, you onboarded recently. What was good and bad? Like, what can we do better? And constantly trying to improve and be inclusive. And sometimes it might even become like at the discomfort of someone else. I remember when the Kubernetes community meetings were Friday at like 9 a.m. Pacific time. And I was like, hey, it's great because I'm Pacific time, but that's not welcoming for everyone. Not everyone is Pacific time. Some people are asleep. And so being able to spread that out and say like, hey, you know what? We have a lot of people in different parts of the world. Maybe 9 a.m. Pacific isn't the best time. And actually taking that feedback and saying, well, we need to record these. They can be up on YouTube, but we also want other voices to be heard, not just people to listen to it. So being able to contribute there was important, in ContribX and all these other SIGs that are focused on the community culture, I guess is the word, but the values that they have. I have All Things Open talk coming up next month that I'm actually recording right now about the community, specifically about how Kubernetes is scaled. And as a project and as code contributions and releases is absolutely important. And part of that, the growing the community constantly, because if you stop growing the community, you're going to stagnate and you're not going to get new contributors and you're not going to get new points of view.
Right.
And so constantly getting that feedback loop is important.
When she said All Things Open, I went there in like 2016. It was a really great conference. Todd, if you're listening, you're awesome. So what's your talk on?
It's called Internet Scale Open Source with Kubernetes.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, everyone check that out when you hear this.
I mean, this has been a lot of fun. It's been great just seeing these podcasts and other channels that have this sort of content that people that maybe are getting started or trying to understand how things work inside the broader CNCF ecosystem. It's not just about like being part of that org or being directly tied to that Kubernetes or anything. Like you could be a part of the community and not contribute code, or even just have some other open source project that uses their projects.
You're very right. And especially in CNCF, there are so many different tasks that need to be done that don't require a text editor. So if you are on the sidelines and want to get in the game, then, you know, there's plenty of opportunities. Anyway, that's all we got today, folks. I gotta go get a haircut.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this one. Do tune in next time. We're really excited about our lineup of guests. We have a super exciting guest next week. As well, check out the show notes for this podcast at podcast.curiefense.io. That's CURIEFENSE. Podcast.curiefense.io for the Commuting to Cloud Native podcast. Thanks again for listening. Tune in next week. Catch you later.